Michelle, you give me please a heads up when current colleagues have been admitted, others will come in progress.
Yes, we're ready to start, Jeff.
We're ready to start. So good morning or good afternoon, evening, depending on where you are today. Welcome. My name is Jeff Gedmin with American Purpose. We have others who will join us in the next minute, folks who are registered and running a little bit late. Let me say a little bit about American Purpose, which is almost 1 year old. We'll be 1 year old in October. And then I have a couple colleagues and dear friends who will say a few words before we get to the main discussion, main event this morning. We founded American Purpose 11 months ago, principally around 3 goals. First, to defend classical liberalism against attacks left and right, to promote American engagement, continued engagement in the world against what I would call a national movement, or rather national mood. Maybe it develops as a movement of retrenchment. And also third, the idea that culture matters and is important to us for a variety of reasons. We're not an arts and culture enterprise. You know, we do online publishing and podcasts and Zoom discussions and policy debates. We're not an arts and culture outfit, but I would note to you that we note that more than half of the people who listen and watch and attend and read our work are 35 years old and younger. And from these early and mid-career professional colleagues come some splendid contributions, unsolicited, in fact, self-initiated in the world of art and architecture and film and so forth. It's important to our audience and community. It's important to us. Let me also add that we are very cognizant of the work we do in context. And there's a fight on today, and it's a fight over understanding liberalism and its discontents. We'll come back to that in a moment. In preserving, in my language, democratic capitalism by understanding that to preserve it, we have to reform it. And I would say that throughout our work, we're interested not just in diagnosing and describing problems, but if I may say, managing, solving, making things better. That's the way we see ourselves. I offer a big thanks to our small but fabulous team at American Purpose. More about them in due course. This is a 3-day virtual conference. To everybody in the community, including those who contribute financially, look at our website. All of you are important, but it's so heartening to know that there are so many people here and abroad who generously support in all sorts of different levels and amounts. I'm grateful. So with that scene setting, we have 2 partners today, but they're partners that precede the conference and continue. And I'll introduce them both and give them the floor for welcoming words. Norm Eisen is a friend. He is a former US ambassador to the Czech Republic. He's a scholar at the Brookings Institution and currently wears so many hats. If I tried to name them all, it would take 45 minutes at least. He and I co-chair something called the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, homed at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And then Michael Žantovský, who also is a dear friend, who was a neighbor of mine in London when he was Czech ambassador there. He's been Czech ambassador to the United States. He's been Czech ambassador to Israel. He's been an elected Czech politician, senator, and he is now, I should also say, he is the biographer of Vassal Havel, and he is now the executive director of the Vassal Havel Library, and Michael joins us from Prague. Michael, great to see you, and warmest thanks. Norm, great to see you, and warmest thanks. Norm, if I may, you first. welcome and introductory thoughts and framing comments, and then we'll hear from Michael, and then over to our speaker this morning. But Norm, you first, you have the floor, and welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, Frank, and everyone who makes American Purpose such a incredible, really 21st century virtual forum for defending liberalism from all corners. And just looking at the screen here, I see the friends of American Purpose from every part of the political spectrum, and for what you do in keeping us as Americans engaged in the world. And I love the cultural aspects of American Purpose. I will confess that the defense of liberalism is like the vegetables, but the culture that you do is the dessert, and I just love it. It's somewhat of a birthday party today, and those of us at the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which, as Jeff explained, he and I co-chair. We're also, we try to model this idea of a bipartisan and indeed the views are so diverse, it's a multi-partisan array of over 200 folks representing 75 institutions who are unified, whatever our differences, around the idea of liberal democracy, not only as an end in itself, but also as a critical transatlantic national security and transatlantic security pillar. We're very pleased to be partners in this wonderful series of events, to hear from Frank momentarily. It's somewhat of a birthday party for American Purpose, a slightly early birthday party. As a parent, I'm accustomed to attending these parties. I think, despite your low average age, Jeff, the average age is a little higher than at the usual one-year birthday party that I have attended. I will say a quick word of hello to my friend, my transatlantic partner, and my partner in both the multilateral and bilateral Czech-American relationship, Michael Žantovský, one of my teachers when I became a diplomat, unseasonably late in my professional career, and contrary to all my natural dispositions and tendencies, Michael took me under his wing, and I'm grateful to him for that. And he has a great deal to say about this relationship. The three of us who precede Frank this morning all have strong Prague ties. Of course, Michael's are self-explanatory. I served as ambassador there, and I'm also a Czech American. My mother is from the former Czechoslovakia, and Jeff, of course, served there as the head of RFERL, where I first met him, and we forged our bipartisan friendship. That crucible, the last thing I'll say before passing it to Michael, is that Prague, and the Czech lands, those crucibles of freedom, both remind us of the importance of liberal democracy, the fragility of liberal democracy, the role of the United States. If you study the history of the Czech lands, the critical role of the United States in guaranteeing freedom and security and liberty in Europe, and the dangers which American Purpose was created, to having been there at the creation, created to forestall and prevent. We are on much thinner ice. 2020 was a much closer call in the United States than is popularly appreciated. I know the 5 screens of folks we have here do appreciate what a close call it was and what tremendous danger we remain in. And the history of Czech democracy over the past century plus is a reminder to us of that fragility of how hard we must work to defend liberal democracy, and how fortunate we are to have Jeff, Frank, all of the American purpose, lean, excellent Delta force of democracy, your staff, and all of those on this and not on this Zoom who are part of this marvelous, marvelous institution. You are part of the reason this green 21st century Zoom community is part of the reason that I'm optimistic in spite of the vast challenges that we face here at home and abroad. Thank you for the honor of allowing me to welcome everyone, of allowing the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group to partner on this marvelous event. I'm looking forward to hearing from Michael and then from Frank. Thanks all.
So Norm, Ambassador Eisen, thank you very, very much. You may see on our website later today the moniker Delta Force for Democracy, so keep an eye out for that. Norm, you and I co-chair the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our colleague Jonathan Katz manages it and leads it from his spot at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Jonathan will be with us to moderate a session this week. This is a 3-day Zoom conference. So Ambassador Žantovský, dear friend Michael, you have the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the Vassal Havel Library, so maybe a few words about the institution first. Vassal Havel Library is a presidential library and museum, actually modeled after some of the American presidential libraries and museums. It is not simply a library, it is a library, an archive, a publisher, an educational institution, a venue for conferences, dialogues, discussions, meetings, encompassing the broad liberal spectrum from left to right, very inclusive, and it is the primary repository of the literary, political, and spiritual legacy of a very unique individual, great and talented playwright and essayist, long-time dissident, a prisoner of conscience, a leader of one of the few successful revolutions in the history of the 20th century, and finally president of 2 actually countries in succession. And in spite of all of this, he never lost his sense of humor. For several years now, we have been organizing in the library the annual Václav Havel European Dialogues to discuss current issues of European policy and integration. And last June at the GlobSec Security Conference in Bratislava, we decided to use the window of opportunity offered by the election of a new American president and start a parallel conference series, the Václav Havel Transatlantic Dialogues. Well, as the window of opportunity seems to be closing rather quickly, let me consider this exchange also as the second installment of the Václav Havel Transatlantic Dialogues. And thank you, Jeff, for including us. Now, for the topic, I will not mince words. I mean, the future of liberalism looks bleak. On both sides of the Atlantic, liberalism is under attack. In a way, this has always been the case. To a degree, it is inevitable, for liberalism is essentially a doctrine of tolerance, of allowing for various perspectives and various points of view. It is constitutionally poorly suited to discounting or suppressing other points of view as heretical, reactionary, or subversive. And at the same time, it is being attacked from both right and left as being responsible for both the excesses and shortcomings of modern capitalism, for both the failures of globalism and for ignoring the less developed parts of the world, for trying to export democracy to other parts of the world, and for ignoring the plight of its poor and oppressed, for the increases in inequality, and for the extremes of egalitarianism, for being rooted in the history and tradition of the old world, and for trying to destroy it at the same time. In the West, which is often used as just another pejorative label for liberal democracy these days, liberalism is today a synonym for the mainstream establishment, whatever views it advocates, under attack from populists, nationalists, and proto-fascists on the right, and progressivists, egalitarians, and postmodernists on the left. This crisis has been going on for some time, but it has become exacerbated by the most recent events. The traumatic experience of the pandemic has relativized the perspective of human freedom, human rights, and their limitations. The explosive protests against the remainders of historic injustices or against the dangers of climatic changes have affected perceptions of the freedom of expression, the due process, and human rights. And after a long time, the very legitimacy of the democratic political system has become to be questioned in our part of the world. The economic fallout of the pandemic, the growing inequality, and the rapid development of the digital and shared economies have led to calls for a bigger regulatory role of the state in economics and for a bigger social welfare state. The short-sightedness of politicians, together with problems experienced on both sides of the Atlantic, have led to the weakening of the feeling of shared responsibility for the future of this world and towards renewed signs of isolationism, mercantilism, and protectionism in international relations. It's suffice to look at the events of the last 2 days, the exchanges between some of the Europeans and the American government, and you know what I'm talking about. In part, the fault rests with the liberals themselves, for they have been lately too often trying to adapt to the spirit of the times and excuse or even incorporate ideas or policies that clearly contradict the essential principles of liberal thinking instead of clearly elucidating and defending them. And I will end with Václav Havel. Exactly 19 years ago, yesterday, on the 19th of September 2002, when Václav Havel unveiled the bust of the first Czechoslovak president and a great Atlanticist, avant la lettre, Thomas Garrigue Masaryk in Washington, he explicitly listed the ideals which link the two sides of the Atlantic by saying, and I will quote, "Human freedom, human rights, democratic political system, free market economy, and human responsibility for the world, which, as Masaryk told us, is rooted in the awareness that the miracle of this world and of the human existence is not merely a matter of coincidence, but goes back to the original creator," unquote. And true, Many liberals would contest the idea of the creator as part of the liberal universe. Havel, however, would have argued that while freeing the creator from the responsibility for the current events indeed constitutes a part of the liberal thought, banishing him altogether along with the mystery of the creation of this world is neither liberal nor necessary, because it might also liberate us from our own moral responsibility in the process. Thank you.
Jeff, you're muted.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ambassador Žantovský. Eloquent and beautifully framed by you, and Norm by Ambassador Eisen. And so now we turn to Frank Fukuyama, who is, as you all know, author, scholar, Stanford professor. He's co-founder of American Purpose. He's chair of our editorial board. Frank, you helped launch this last October, with an essay titled Liberalism and Its Discontents. We followed on with a symposium, 10 replies by 10 writers, public intellectuals, a pretty good range, from Sam Moyn to Shika Dalmia, responding to what you had to say. And then you've dug a bit further, as you do, and you've turned your essay into a book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, which will be published in April. And I think the essay and the book helps us a lot understanding what is the problem we're trying to solve or manage. I'll say to all of you in advance that the book lays it out. What is classical liberalism is the name of one chapter. From liberalism to neoliberalism is another chapter, and there are chapters on liberalism turns on itself, identity, alternatives, ? So we look forward to reading the book in full, final published form in April, Frank. Congratulations in advance. But to you, to talk to us about the subject, to talk to us about the book, and then we will have time for Q&A. It's 9:55 Eastern. Frank has the floor, 11 a.m. Eastern, hard stop. Frank, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So it's a great pleasure to have worked with you and the crew at American Purpose. I think we really do have a purpose, which, as has been said already, is to defend classical liberalism. And writing that introductory essay actually made me go back and think about the underlying theory behind liberalism. Liberalism has been the dominant philosophy in the West, especially since 1945 with the defeat of fascism, and then after 1989 with the collapse of communism. But in a way, it was so much part of the environment that I think a lot of us just took it for granted. And I think that now that it's, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the threats to liberalism, because the previous speakers, Norm and Michael, have laid them out. You know, they come from Russia, from China, from populist nationalists within democratic countries. They come from a progressive left that has become increasingly intolerant. And so liberalism as a system of ideas, you know, I think needs to be revisited and needs to be refortified. And so that's what I've tried to do in that original essay. And that's what I have laid out in the book. So let me just go over some basic ideas about why I'm a liberal and why I think all the rest of us should be liberals. Let me just read you a definition of liberalism that was written by the political theorist, the British political theorist John Gray. He says that it's a distinctive modern set of ideas that is individualist in that it asserts the moral primacy of the person against the claims of any social collectivity. It's egalitarian in as much as it confers on all men, and I would say now all women, the same moral status, and denies the relevance to legal or political order of differences in moral worth among human beings. It is universalist, affirming the moral unity of the human species. and according secondary importance to specific historic associations and cultural forms. And finally, it is meliorist in its affirmation of the corrigibility and improvability of all social institutions and political arrangements. And although John Gray has been a critic of liberalism, I think that's actually not a bad definition. Liberal institutions are based on the rule of law, laws that limit the power of governments to do simply what they want, including democratically legitimated ones. They make sure that power is limited and that the rights of individuals to buy, sell, to express themselves, to associate, and to have beliefs are protected, generally speaking, under a strong constitutional order. All right, so that's classical liberalism. And in my view, it's compatible with a lot of different social and economic arrangements. So for example, in the economy, property rights and contract enforcement have always been key features of any liberal society. But property rights and contract enforcement are also compatible with a relatively expansive welfare state that tries to equalize social outcomes. And I would argue that that's actually been critical for the survival of liberalism, because if you simply have economic liberalism without the democratic corrective that minimizes inequality, you're going to end up with something that's neither liberal nor democratic. So let me just go over 3 reasons why we should all be liberals, right? The first reason really has to do with diversity. Liberalism is a doctrine that seeks to manage diversity. It was born in the second half of the 17th century after Europe experienced 150 years of religious warfare following the Protestant Reformation. This is a period in which maybe a third of the population of Germany died in the course of the 30 Years' War, directly and indirectly on account of these religious conflicts. People were burned at the stake for believing in transubstantiation and other bizarre doctrines whose relevance today seems to be very minimal. And the early founders of liberalism, people like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, understood that if you are going to base a society on a substantive, strong view that is defined by a particular religious doctrine, you're asking for trouble, that people do not agree on the final ends that human beings follow. Therefore, you need to lower the horizon of politics to exclude agreement on these final ends in favor of simple survival. So the right to life was basic for Thomas Hobbes, that instead of people killing themselves over doctrinal issues, everybody had a common interest in physical security. And that's what a liberal state was meant to provide. That diversity can take many forms. So in the 17th century, it was primarily religious between different sects of Christian believers. It could be national, however, and the next big challenge to liberalism occurred in the 19th century as you shifted from dynastic arrangements to modern nationalism, where people believed that national boundaries ought to correspond to cultural units defined by language, by shared ethnicity and history. And in the course of the 19th century, you had the unification of Germany and Italy, the dissolution at the time of the First World War of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, and similar kind of bloody mess that accompanied the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries. And liberalism became the dominant organizing principle of the Western world after 1945, again in response to people's experience of the violence that is created when you try to organize societies on a strong cultural basis in which everybody is expected to have the same set of beliefs, or the same ethnicity, or the same understanding of national culture. So that's the first clear reason why we should be liberals. We live in diverse societies. And by the way, that diversity, it can be religious, it can be national, and it can be other things. Like Poland today is one of the most ethnically and religiously homogeneous societies, and yet it is strongly polarized, largely between, better educated urban, city dwellers and people that are more conservative, living in smaller towns and villages in the countryside, and so forth. And there's a bitter conflict between those two groups that are not divided by race or religion, but still hate each other. And you need liberalism in order to overcome divisions like that. All right, so that's the first justification. It's a very pragmatic one, that we don't agree on final ends. We have to lower the horizons of politics and agree on a basic set of rules that allow us to live and tolerate one another. The second argument is a moral one, and that is that human beings, individual human beings, are moral agents. In the course of my new book and in my last book, Identity, I trace the intellectual history of this, and I think it really comes out of a Judeo-Christian understanding of human agency. Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis for eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that gave them a moral status that was higher than the rest of nature, but lower than that of God. And that original sin was why they were cast out of the garden. But it also gave them this distinctive human ability to make choices. And I think that understanding of human, so you say, well, why would anybody think that all human beings are equal? They're obviously different in skin color, in gender, in intelligence, in accomplishments, in their personal characteristics. On what grounds could you possibly say that all men are created equal, as Thomas Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence? And I think the traditional moral answer to that is that we are all moral creatures. Martin Luther King, in his famous speech in 1964, said he wanted a society in which people were not judged on the basis of the color of their skin, but on the content of their characters, meaning the kind of moral decisions that they could make. And this gets developed in Western thought through a series of thinkers. I think Martin Luther actually is quite important in the course of the Protestant Reformation in saying that the seat of Christian belief ultimately was this interior sense of faith, which created this opposition between my inner self and the outer world that set social rules. But real value came from that inner deciding core. With Immanuel Kant, you had a transmuting of a Christian belief in moral agency, where you could accept God or not, into a secular version of it. So Kant says human beings are moral agents first and foremost before they have any actual physical or other characteristics. And it is that agency that makes them ends in themselves and therefore dictates a morality that says you cannot use human beings as means to other ends, and therefore attacks any kind of utilitarian philosophy. And I think that there's a Christian Kantian understanding of moral agency that is really the basis for our modern understandings of dignity. If you look at the German Constitution of 1949, the basic law in Germany, or this is true in the Japanese Constitution and the South African Constitution, there's a right to dignity that has been embedded in many of these foundational documents. And if you ask a politician in any of these countries, on what is human dignity based, I think they'll be tongue-tied. They won't be able to answer that question. But I think if you look at the historical genesis of it, it really has to do with this belief that human beings are universally moral agents, and that capacity for choice needs to be protected. And so that's the moral claim that liberalism makes, that it protects the autonomy of every single individual human being and makes sure that that autonomy is not overridden by demands of the collectivity. So, all right, so the final justification is economic. among the individual rights that liberal regimes protect is the right to own private property. And it's the right to adjudicate disputes through a system of law where those disputes can be managed peacefully rather than through resort to force. You can actually protect property rights without a rule of law. It's, there's something called the mafia where you enforce property rights through private individuals who carry guns and shoot people that welch on contracts. But there's good reason why that should be a monopoly of a modern state, and that power exercised through impersonal judicial institutions. And right from the beginning, liberalism was closely associated with modernization, with economic growth. The earliest modernizing states in Europe were Britain and the Netherlands, both of which had liberal constitutions that protected property rights. That was transmitted to North America and is one of the reasons why the United States grew rapidly. And if you look at other late developers like Japan and Germany, they were not initially democratic, but they were liberal. You had a Rechtsstaat in Germany in the 19th century, in which individual property rights were respected, even though it didn't have fully democratic elections. And Germany, as a consequence, became the leading economic power in Europe by the end of the 19th century. So those are the three reasons. Pragmatic reason, it's a way of controlling violence. The moral reason, it's a way of protecting universal human autonomy. And the third reason, it has to do with economic growth, close association with liberalism, with the modern world and all the benefits, the health and freedom benefits that come from living in liberal societies. And I would say that people are voting with their feet, right? Nobody's running to China or to Russia that's in trouble. They come to Europe, they come to the United States because they want to live in that kind of a prosperous, free, liberal society. Now, the basic argument of my book is one that I started in the article, but I've fleshed out to a much greater degree, and that has to do with liberalism's discontents. And the general argument is the following. Liberalism starts with these basic principles, as I've outlined, but over the past, let's say, 5 decades, those liberal ideas have been taken to extremes where they begin to undermine themselves and at a certain point cease to be liberal. And the discontents, I think, with contemporary liberalism have less to do with the original doctrine than with the way that the doctrine has been interpreted and extended, and that's a problem on both the right and the left. All right, so let me go through each of those. Let's begin with the problem on the right. And this is the evolution of economic liberalism, basically a doctrine that protects property rights and a rule of law into something that is now labeled neoliberalism. So for many, in fact, I was just at a party yesterday in which I could hear there are a lot of 20-something people jokingly attacking each other as neoliberals. And I think that for many people, the term is used in a very sloppy manner. And for some people, for some progressives, neoliberalism is capitalism. And it's a way of denouncing capitalism as a system. I have a much more specific definition of it, which really has to do with the rise of the Chicago school and a more extreme version of some basic economic ideas that are associated with people like Milton Friedman and George Stigler and Gary Becker and so forth, in which the foundational ideas, the foundational economic model, I think, was carried to extremes. It had lots of policy implications. It led to the expansion of trade pacts and kind of globalization that we've experienced over the past several decades. It led to, for example, American authorities not really caring about the emergence of very large corporations because they were held to be more efficient and therefore, not problematic in a democratic society. And I think they also ignored what I would say is a fundamental pro-social side of human behavior. And I just want to make clear, that there's something in the underlying neoclassical economic model that is correct, which is that people respond to incentives. People do have a selfish, individualistic side where they want to accumulate resources and they will behave rationally in order to do that. That's the basic economic model that drives a great deal of human behavior. So, for example, in China, when collective farms were disbanded after the household responsibility law in 1979 and replaced by that act in which peasants were allowed to keep the surplus that they produced, all of a sudden Chinese agriculture took off because now peasants had a real incentive to grow their own fruits and vegetables, sell them on a market, and accumulate wealth. So there's clearly, a side of that model that is absolutely correct. If you don't pay attention to incentives, you're going to end up with big problems. But the problem with neoliberalism, I think, is that it took that basic insight and carried it to an extreme. And there's several respects in which this is true, kind of an absolute respect for property rights without respect to, the origins of, where those property rights came from. I think that globalization sought a kind of economic efficiency that didn't take account of the political blowback that would come about when it turned out that not every individual in every liberal society benefited equally from free trade and the like. And we're sort of living with the populist consequences of that. And I think the final issue was really the hostility to the state, where that was probably the single unifying idea that bound together neoliberals, libertarians, and a lot of other people, that they simply did not, they saw the state as a fundamental obstacle to economic growth, one that had to be minimized and in some cases done away with. And I think that's actually been a lot of the writing that I've done over the past 20 years. My political order books are really all about why states are actually very important, right? A legitimate monopoly of force that can actually enforce laws and provide order. And you don't get economic growth unless you've got states. And if you don't have a state, then you've got Syria or Libya or Iraq or any number of other places where it's really the weakness of the state that is responsible for chaos, for lack of growth and the like. And this kind of thinking, I think, was encouraged by, the hostility to excessive state regulation that was experienced in the 1970s, in many Western countries, but then universalized. And I think one of the tragedies when the Soviet Union fell apart is that was kind of the peak of this neoliberal view, and people simply did not understand that you couldn't, for example, privatize a state-owned enterprise in Russia or Ukraine if you didn't have a strong rule of law and the ability to enforce those rules. And that did not exist in that period. All right, so that's the first example of a liberal idea that gets carried to an unsupportable extreme. I think that, there are other problems with the doctrine that are actually not problems with neoliberalism. There are sort of problems with the underlying economic model, but we can perhaps get into that in the discussion. The other side of the coin was something that was more prevalent among people on the left, which was the absolutization of the idea of autonomy, right? So I said that autonomy, as it was originally understood, was a religious idea, that you had the freedom, human beings had the freedom to obey God's moral law or not. That's what made them free, and that's what made them autonomous. But they did not have the ability to make up what that law was. That law was given to them by God And if you look at the secular version of it that Kant put forward, the law doesn't come from God, it comes from these abstract rules of reason. So people are not free to make up their own rules. They have to abide by things like the categorical imperative. They can do it or not because they are free agents, but the rules themselves are established by somebody else. And one of the things that's happened over time is that all of the preceding moral frameworks that used to define the rules within which autonomy was exercised have essentially been eroded. A lot of this has to do with the decline of established religion, the rise of secularism, the fact that there's no longer agreement on the underlying set of rules, and then a vast expansion of people's understanding of what autonomy is and what it ought to encompass, to the point where there's a belief that actually it's the ability to make up moral rules itself that is the core of human autonomy. This is actually an idea that comes from Friedrich Nietzsche. His character Zarathustra doesn't simply proclaim the death of God, but he, in a way, is the new God who is able to make new moral rules. And the highest form of human freedom is actually that freedom to make rules, and it leads to a kind of moral chaos, because obviously you can't have a society if you don't have agreed upon rules. But if everybody gets to make up their own moral framework, then you basically don't have a basis for collective action or for basic stability in a society. And I think that as the decades have gone by, we've seen this expansion of autonomy play itself out in all sorts of ways. By the way, that Nietzschean idea that freedom, that moral autonomy involves the ability to make up your own moral framework. He actually says that in Casey versus Pennsylvania, this famous ruling related to abortion, where he says, human freedom is the ability to, imagine, your own world, and to, create your own value system. And this has become very embedded. And I actually, in the new book, had a whole chapter on John Rawls, who I think embodies this mode of thinking, which is, I think, very comparable to neoliberalism on the right, because Rawls says very clearly that the choosing individual is prior to any of these substantive goods that human beings pursue. I mean, that's very abstract, but essentially it means that there is no dominant understanding of the good life that anybody can hold over anybody else, and that the primary moral imperative is to protect the ability to choose itself rather than any particular good that human beings seek. And in a way, it's kind of a crazy understanding of liberalism, because it's basically choice for its own sake, not for the sake of choosing virtue, for choosing community, for choosing, to live within a particular tradition. And I think that has been responsible for, the kind of lack of shared moral understandings that we experience now in liberal societies. It then veers off into a different direction, because a lot of people on the left look around them and they say, well, this is actually, we don't want individuals choosing for themselves, but we're actually embedded in as groups. And so African Americans, women, gays and lesbians, we're not choosing individuals. We have been marginalized, and we've been put in these particular boxes by the surrounding dominant society. And for us, moral choice actually has to be an assertion of our ability as a group to, put forward demands to make us more equal. And over time, this has both a good effect and a bad effect. I think that modern identity politics is this demand for group recognition. And the good part of it is when identity politics is seen as the completion of the liberal project. That is to say, African Americans have a legacy of slavery. They're not treated equally, even when the laws say that they're supposed to be treated equally. In fact, they're not. And we simply want people of color to enjoy the same rights that they're promised in the formal law. But we want that to happen in society itself. So in that sense, identity politics is a completion of liberalism. But there's another form of identity politics that grew up around, critical theory. I mean, it's kind of impossible to talk about critical theory today because it's been so bastardized, on both sides. But, the original form of critical theory evolved into a critique, not just of liberal practice, right? So it wasn't just a critique saying liberal societies don't live up to their own universalistic aspirations to equal recognition, but they are fundamentally wrong, and they're fundamentally wrong in a number of ways. That, first of all, people aren't individuals; they don't recognize their group identities, and that societies need to recognize people as members of racial groups, as where their gender is important, or the intersection of race and gender, and so forth. And they denied, contract theory, this idea that actually our liberal order is a result of a voluntary agreement to live under certain common rules, as opposed to a form of domination that was put forward by elites. And then finally, I think the thing that we're suffering from today, which is an attack on an important part of liberalism that really had to do with cognition and modes of knowing things. And by knowing things, I don't mean how do we arrive at shared values, because I think liberalism assumes that we're not going to agree on the deepest issues. We may come out of different religious faiths and have different understandings of the good life, but how do we agree on just facts themselves, like who won the last election, and so forth. And the liberal Enlightenment had a technique for this, which was called modern natural science, in which you used empirical observation and then a series of methodologies by which you could reject conclusions that were not supported by data, and then progressively agree on what the external world looked like as a result of experiment, observation, inference, deduction, and so forth. And that came under critique really from the left before it was attacked from the right. I trace all of this. It's funny, I actually studied with Jacques Derrida. I met Michel Foucault when I was an undergraduate at Cornell. I read, Jacques Lacan and all of these postmodern writers. The corpus that they produced was really something that led to this critique of modern rationality, of Enlightenment rationality. It begins with a critique of language with Ferdinand de Saussure, this Swiss linguist, who said that words don't actually refer to objects in the real world, they shape the world. And there's a kind of subjectivity in language that the speaker of the word imposes on reality. And I think Foucault is really the one that develops this the furthest, in which he said, basically language and science itself are instruments of power, that there are hidden elites that want you to, they don't want to rule over you in the way they used to by putting you in jail and threatening your life. They're going to rule you in a more subtle way by manipulating what seems to be a neutral scientific method, but in fact is leading to incarceration of certain people, that is declaring certain people mentally unfit, like gays and lesbians and so forth. So the language that these people use is actually a form of power. And therefore, you have to recognize that you're being manipulated through the use of language and through the use of modern natural science. And I think, in a way, you can see the origins of modern conspiratorial thinking in all of that, where you have this idea that there are elites that hold power. They don't want to express that power directly, and they do it by manipulating, essentially you through language and media. And I'm afraid that that's now drifted over to the right. I had originally written, actually in a blog post in American Purpose, that I don't think that anyone in the Trumpist right has actually read Foucault, although the fact is that they're actually using a lot of his ideas. It turns out that's not right, that somebody pointed out to me that there were actually several people in Trump's circle, speechwriters and so forth, that actually put two and two together. They said, yeah, that's right. There are elites that are manipulating us. There are people like Anthony Fauci and the CDC and so forth that are using this supposedly neutral language of science to achieve hidden political ends. And if you combine that with the rise of the internet, where essentially anyone can say anything, without subjecting it to the kinds of standards of proof and empirical confirmation that had previously been used since the Enlightenment as ways of understanding how the world actually works, you end up in this situation of what's been called epistemic relativism, right? In a sense, we're all value relativists. We admit that we're not going to agree on final values, but we could agree on facts. But that has become progressively less possible. And a critique that started with people on the left has now drifted over to the right. And it's put us in this kind of epistemic wasteland that's powered by technology, in which we cannot agree on who won the last election, is the vaccine safe, all of the kinds of issues that we're confronting in our contemporary liberal society. So anyhow, I'm going to stop. These are the discontents, I think, both on the right and on the left, where liberal ideas are taken to extremes where they begin to undermine themselves. They undermine the idea of individual autonomy, of individual equality, and the like. And that's really what we've got to walk back, because I don't think that liberalism necessarily implies, these further extensions of themselves. The last chapter, I've got, a number of suggestions for, broad principles that liberal societies ought to follow. So, for example, I think that the cardinal liberal virtue is tolerance. It is not uniformity of thought. And so as long as people behave with tolerance, they should not expect that everybody's going to agree with them. And people on both the right and the left don't accept that today, right? That there's a lot of people on the ethno-nationalist right that don't like racial diversity. They don't like the kind of gender claims that have been put forward, and they kind of want to roll society back to a period prior to that. People on the left don't accept political diversity. When they talk about diversity, it's all race, gender, sexual orientation. It's not political diversity in the sense of accepting, people from red states with conservative views or religious views and the like. And this is why I think a restoration of a basic idea of tolerance is really critical in a liberal society. Final thing I'll just end up with has to do with nations. One of the big problems with liberalism is that it is universal.
Michelle, I have Frank frozen on screen. You the same?
I do as well. Frank,
okay,
can you
stand by, everybody.
You could log out and log back in.
So he is doing so. Stand by, everybody. 1 minute.
Yeah.
Well, Frank will be with us momentarily. Dan Baer, thank you for your comment in chat, a cliffhanger, and you all stay with us. It will be hard to do the Q&A without Frank.
Here he comes.
Brilliant. There we are.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear. You're back. Thank you, Frank.
Okay, I had to switch. I don't know what happened with my other computer, but it just stopped working. So look, let me just conclude. I mean, I think there's also a big problem in that liberals have a hard time defining nations and why one ought to be loyal to nations as opposed to mankind as a whole. I've got a discussion that we can get into as to why nations still remain an important locus of community, and particularly a locus of political power, and that if you move to some supranational form of organization, you're going to end up, in a lot of trouble. But with that, let me just close and, let's move on to questions, comments, and the like.
Wonderful. Thank you, Frank. That was rich and stimulating and challenging. So thank you so much. The floor is open. We have 20 minutes or so, actually, for questions. If it's in chat, I'm going to let it stand as a question or comment in chat to everyone. If you actually wish to pose a question, would you press the button, the raised hand function? If I miss you, our managing editor, my colleague Michelle High, will bring to my attention whom I'm missing. So who first? Michelle, do we have a hand raised?
Yes, Vivek Tangam.
Over to you then, please. And in each case, if you would all briefly introduce yourself, and in deference to other colleagues, please try to be brief in your question or comment, please.
Hi, my name is Vivek. I work as an engineer for Army Futures Command. I'm a big fan of all the work that you guys do, and it's really awesome to hear from you all directly. My question,
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. My question has to do with the nature of capitalism versus democracy. Capitalism sort of assumes that money and resources are what are fundamental to creating a just society, but democracy more so seems to value human dignity and respect in our ability to control the political structure. So why should we tie capitalism with its emphasis on resources with democracy when those two seem to value fundamentally different things?
Okay, well, thanks for that. I don't think that they do actually value fundamentally different things, because part of what constitutes human autonomy and therefore human dignity is the ability to accumulate resources, to own property, to take care of your family, right? And so among the different rights that autonomous individuals hold in a liberal society, it is that ability to transact that's part of their humanness. And just because human beings have this pro-social side does not mean that that kind of self-interest is not important. And I think as a practical matter, you've been able to reconcile. In fact, I would say this reconciliation is a necessary one. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, you had this extremely brutal competitive form of capitalism that created large inequalities and led to the growth of labor movements, trade unions, and ultimately communist and socialist parties that wanted to abolish capitalism altogether. And the only way that you could maintain a basic respect for things like property rights was by combining capitalism with a redistributive welfare state that tried to protect individuals from some of the worst excesses of market inequality. And so I would say, it's not that they're incompatible with one another, they need each other. If you don't have a capitalism that is moderated by a need to respect the dignity and the belief in equality that individuals have, then then the liberalism, the economic system is not going to work.
So I'm going to take the liberty, if I may, Frank, of following on. We have a economist colleague, many of you know, named Erwin Stelzer, who says, among other things, if capitalism is to survive, the capitalists must restrain themselves. And my question, as additional follow-on, Frank, is, could you say a little bit something about what is tolerable and what is intolerable in terms of the excess of capitalism, in terms of the stresses of inequality, and where are we today in managing these problems in terms of, in context of regulation, responsibility, restraint? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a big agenda. So I think that at one level, there's a clear policy response that capitalism needs to be regulated. And the whole Chicago school was very anti-regulation as a matter of principle. And there's clearly areas where there's excessive regulation, but particularly for the financial sector, if you do not have pretty strict regulation of the way that, let's say, large financial institutions manage risks, you're going to end up in the situation we had in 2008, where they take risks, they go down, but they take the rest of the economy with them. And so that agenda is there. I think that this is something I've written about in other contexts. I think the big internet platforms have been very toxic in many ways to democratic discourse, and it's largely because they have not been regulated. I have specific ideas about how you would go about doing that in a way that would preserve the efficiencies and the benefits that they bring, but it's something that we haven't really taken seriously. But I think that there's a social side to it as well, where there's been a change in the ethos. I think one of the most destructive articles that was written in this neoliberal tradition was this famous article that Milton Friedman wrote, where he said the primary duty of any business owner was to maximize profits, and that any other social good was really secondary. And I think that's something that's been absorbed by a couple of generations of MBAs and people that lead corporate America, where rather than having these rather paternalistic companies that cared about the welfare of their workers and would try to do whatever they could to support their local communities, you had this financially driven form of capitalism in which Wall Street was demanding that they squeeze out every single penny of efficiency that they could out of their workers, out of their suppliers, out of their customers, frankly. And that, I think, has led to a lot of the kind of pushback that we've seen. I know that there are a lot of problems with that analysis, because somebody will immediately say, well, yeah, but you're working in a global system where everybody else is doing that, and you're going to put yourself at a disadvantage. But I do think that, there have been other forms of capitalism that were a little bit less ruthless and a little bit more socially oriented. And I think that's a kind of normative change that really took place, with the advent of neoliberalism.
Thank you. I'm looking for a next hand, and I'm scanning, and Michelle, help me if I'm missing someone. Steve Stancliffe. I think you've, yeah, please, Steve.
Good morning. I was going to direct my question to Dr. Fukuyama. I'm a public education administrator, and it feels like one of the practical concerns of the current historical moment is just a really rapid evolution in the language we use in public discourse. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about just the entry points for contesting some of the things that we would regard as common terms like race and racism and how those play out in public discourse. And I'm particularly concerned with versions of those terms that I encounter that sort of define out of the discourse particular social groups. For example, in the context of race, where power is the primary element in the definition. So I'm not sure if my question came through clearly on that, Dr. Fukuyama.
I'm not quite sure I understand the thrust of the question. I would say that, you know, beginning with Foucault, you do have this strong belief that language is power, right? And that linguistic expressions are, again, not neutral ways of referring to empirical reality, but they are actually, you know, instruments of power and instruments by which elites use their power to, you know, manipulate other people. And I think that that's the direct source of what we call political correctness, because, you know, these days it's common in a university setting, if a professor uses a certain set of words that are not politically correct, the response on the part of the students is not, well, I disagree with that, you know, or that shows, you know, you're not thinking about this right. The response is, I feel unsafe because you said that. Now, why would anybody feel unsafe simply because a professor, you know, utters a certain set of words? And I think the reason for that really does come from this postmodernist tradition where, you know, the distinction between language and the actual exercise of power, you know, between this metaphorical violence by speaking words and real violence has been eroded. And that, you know, has led to this extraordinary sensitivity. I was telling my American Purpose colleagues last night that there's this remarkable statement on the part of the dean of one of our major law schools apologizing for using the word blind spots because this was an intolerable form of ableism that was, you know, disrespecting the dignity of blind people. And, you know, so I think there's actually an intellectual history as to why this sort of thing has happened, that, you know, you have to trace through these different postmodernist thinkers, but it's now become embedded in the way that we, you know, regard language overall. And I think, you know, it's a problem because it means that we cannot speak about certain things. You know, in a liberal society, you need to be able to debate and discuss ideas, but if these ideas are themselves regarded as instruments of power and therefore, you know, not speakable, then you're not going to actually be able to deliberate very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Then I'm going to go to, forgive me if I'm using first name basis, but David, you are next, and then Angus after you.
Do you mean me, David Epstein?
David Epstein, yes, please.
Okay. Hello. Thank you, Frank. I wondered if you could explain a little more why you call all of these things liberalism's discontents. Some of them could be, it seems to me, called policy disagreements, like over trade policy or economic policy. You know, James Madison observed that religious liberty was not really all that popular among the early Americans, and it was sort of a struggle to get it implemented. It seems to me, in general, liberalism encourages discontent because policy is always open to dispute. People are opinionated, people lose elections. So I'm not denying that something seems different or wrong today. I'm just wondering how we can distinguish between a discontent with liberalism as opposed to a discontent within liberalism.
So that can be answered in a number of ways. I think more on the progressive left side, you've got this explicit attack on liberalism. So, you know, in the critical theory tradition, people attack the idea of individuals, you know, this notion, I mean, they attack the kind of Hobbesian Lockean state of nature and say this is a complete fiction, that there was never, you know, individual autonomy, that people are actually not autonomous because they are members of marginalized groups. And so that part of the theory is incorrect. They say that there was actually never a social contract, that any agreement between people of vastly different power is not a free voluntary contract. It's really a form of domination. They would say that in a liberal society, it's inevitably tied to external exploitation. And so therefore, colonialism or neo-colonial domination of non-Western peoples is an intrinsic aspect of liberalism. And so, you know, all of these, and then, you know, finally, you get followers of Herbert Marcuse that basically attack the idea of tolerance. I mean, Marcuse wrote a book called Repressive Tolerance, or an article in which he said that toleration of certain, you know, conservative ideas was actually not, you know, was not appropriate. So all of those, I think, are not policy disagreements. There are, you know, those are fundamental critiques of the underlying theory that guides liberalism. They result in different policies, but the you know, the attack is much deeper than simply saying, well, the tax rate is, you know, too high or too low.
So thank you, David Epstein and Frank. Angus Lapsley, over to you. You have the floor.
Thank you. And for those who don't know me, I'm a UK diplomat and official. And indeed, the very last time I traveled anywhere was to the Munich Security Conference almost 2 years ago. And I found myself giving a speech and noticed that Dr. Fukuyama and Joe Nye were in the front row of the audience. And I can tell you that's a fairly intimidating prospect. The question I had was, I thought you made a sort of wonderfully compelling case for tolerance and moderation being the keys to sort of successful liberalism. And you drew attention to the fact that, you know, neither of those two things are very much in evidence in American politics at the moment. And the American political system, including in its kind of university setting, seems to be moving further and further away from tolerance or moderation. That hasn't really happened to quite the same extreme in Europe. I mean, there's populism in Europe, including in my own country. But by and large, the centre still holds around the principles of tolerance and moderation being at the kind of heart of our societies. And I wonder why you think that difference has emerged. Is it because of the kind of original sin of race in American politics that makes that kind of comfortable liberal set of assumptions just too difficult to reconcile with reality? Or is it because neoliberalism went further in America and caused a bigger proportion of the population to actually feel as though they no longer recognize themselves in the liberal consensus? Thanks.
Yeah, I think both of those interpretations could be correct. It's true that, you know, Reagan and Thatcher were the two proponents of neoliberalism and enacted neoliberal policies. They did go further in the United States because we do have a much more deeply held anti-statist tradition in American politics than in most parts of Europe. And therefore the inequalities, I think, ended up being deeper. You know, as I've thought about it, I really do think that race is pretty fundamental to, you know, the current situation that the United States faces in, you know, several different respects. That, you know, if you thought what the United States would look like if, you know, the old Confederacy were not part of it, you know, so let's say the Civil War had ended differently and they'd formed a separate country, I think the United States would actually look a lot more like Canada. And would have a very different kind of politics, both on the right and on the left. But, you know, one of the things that I think we've learned over the last 4 or 5 years is that, the kind of racial politics that we thought the civil rights era had put to rest really have not been overcome, both in the sense that, there's still racism and there's still a degree of inequality, racial inequality that really shouldn't be, shouldn't be tolerable, but also that, there are still racist attitudes that haven't really disappeared. I mean, we've been hearing things that I really never expected, 20, 30 years ago to be expressed, and certainly not by important, political leaders in American politics. So those are, a couple of things. I think finally, Marty Lipset wrote a book. Well, in fact, he wrote a series of books about American exceptionalism. And one of his fundamental points was that anti-statism is probably one of the deepest aspects of American political culture. And it's deeper than Canada, it's deeper than Britain, certainly deeper than any country in continental Europe. And I think that's one of the reasons that neoliberalism went further. It's one of the reasons why we have this libertarian wing, in the United States. It really doesn't exist in any European country, certainly doesn't exist in Japan or Korea, where, people regard the state as the fundamental enemy. And if you think about all the crazy stuff that's going on about vaccine hesitancy today, you couldn't imagine that going on in a country that didn't have this extremely deeply embedded hostility to state power and state action. And that's something that I think is in a certain way, quite uniquely American. And so that may be another factor that explains, some of those differences. Jeff, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm watching the clock with 3.5 minutes before our hard stop, and I want to keep everybody on time. Frank, we predictably and necessarily move from philosophy to culture, from theory to practice, and we're going to continue that the next 3 days during our 3-day Zoom conference. At 12 noon Eastern, Frank will be in conversation with the mayor of Budapest, who in 2022 may compete with Prime Minister Orban to become the next PM of the country. At 2 p.m. Eastern today, also theory to practice, we have Bob Zellick with us, former Deputy Secretary of State, former U.S. Trade Representative, former World Bank President. But for now, a penultimate and an ultimate thought from my side. Frank and colleagues, as I mentioned, it's a pleasure and privilege because we have so many people in early days working with and contributing to American Purpose who are these senior figures like Joan I and you, Frank, and that's such an honor. But as I said at the top, so many people in their 20s and 30s and 40s from the United States, from across Europe and other countries. And when I ask them why this and why now, and you're busy and you have this tsunami of choice and information, what comes out frequently is curiosity, pluralism, tolerance, and respect for diversity. These are things that fit with your talk, Frank, suggest a certain market test and a community out there for what we're trying to do and the community we're trying to serve. We're trying to be of some help and service. Thank everybody for your valuable time. Thanks Norm Eisen and Michael Žantovský for partnership and kicking us off today. And to you, Frank, for a superb presentation and round of questions. Thank you for your friendship, your colleagueship, your intellectual leadership. For those who have cameras turned off, if you're in a position to do so, if you wouldn't mind, switch your cameras on for a second, just to say hello to everybody in that way and join me. I'm sorry we're not in person, good heavens, one day, but join me in thanking everybody, but you, Frank, for a absolutely superb presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you all. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Thanks.